The Oak Lodge Governance Project is a group of local residents who enjoy living in the Oak Lodge area and who are interested in enhancing the life of our community. In particular, we are interested in exploring different options for local governance that could benefit people in the area. We have a website, oaklodgegovernanceproject.org, that includes videos of the information sessions we have sponsored, describes the grant that we received from Metro to explore governance options, includes articles that were written for the Clackamas Review, and which will tell you about the individuals currently involved in the project, as well as give you ways that you can get involved. If you're interested in the project, please check out our website, contact any member, or email us at oaklodgegovernance@gmail.com. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Eleanor Hunter, who will introduce our speaker for today.
Hello, everyone. It is my delight to introduce Max Wedding. Max, I realize you reached out to the Oak Lodge Governance Project in October of 2020.
Yep.
So Max is graduating next month with a Master's of Public Administration with a focus in local government from Portland State University. And he's particularly interested in the relationships between communities and the governments that represent them. He currently works at the Center for Public Service at PSU as the program manager for the Executive MPA program. Today's presentation is part of his capstone project. The title, Understanding the Community Composition of Oak Lodge Since 1970, uses Census and American Community Survey data to compare the characteristics of Oak Lodge to Clackamas County and the greater Portland metro area. Specifically, the study looks at the total population, race and ethnicity, aging, housing, and household income of the residents of Oak Lodge. His final report will also describe all of the jurisdictions that serve the study area, brief summaries of their individual histories, and the elected officials that represent Oak Lodge. A recording of today's session will be posted to the Governance Project website, along with, as Valerie said, all of our past info sessions. And Max's entire project will be posted there as well as soon as it's completed. So a moment of logistics for questions. If you have questions through the course of the presentation, please use the chat box, and we'll pause after each section. Again, there's 5 sections, and we'll pause after each section for questions specific to that area. And we'll hold larger project-wide questions for the end of the presentation. So with that, and with deep thanks for the tremendous contribution that he has made to the Governance Project, I am delighted to welcome Max Wedding.
Hi, everybody. It's great to meet a lot of you for the first time. See some of you who I've met in the past. Greg Chamov, great to see you again. I actually worked with Greg, who represents the Milwaukee, Oak Lodge area, parts of the Oak Lodge area for the Clackamas Community College Board, where I worked for 6 years. So my interest in Oak Lodge goes back actually quite a long time. And so as Eleanor mentioned, I reached out to the project back in October of 2020 as I was really getting into the meat of my grad program. Oh, great. Hi, Catherine. Glad to know you're an EMPA grad. I might follow up with you later. I'm relatively new in the Executive MPA role over at Portland State University, and just really glad to be here today with everybody. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get going. Okay. So as Eleanor said, this presentation really seeks to document the demographic trends of the Oak Lodge area in the 5 areas that you see highlighted here: the total population of the area, race and ethnicity, age, housing, and household income. Throughout the presentation, I will also share that same data for Clackamas County and the Portland metro area, both to provide context as well as some comparison. It's difficult to look at some data for one spot without looking at it for the broader area. So I think that provides some useful points of points of comparison throughout the presentation. So when we talk about Oak Lodge, I want to talk a little bit about the area that we're looking at today. And part of the difficulty in sort of designing this project was that the area that people know as Oak Lodge doesn't really exist to, for instance, the Census Bureau, or at least it didn't before, say, 1990. So it was difficult for us to find a good way to look at the study area over a period of time. And the best way to do that was to use what we call census tracts. And so each of these vaguely square-ish shapes is a census tract. And we can get reliable census tract data for this area back until 1970. So that was the reason for that particular time frame that we're looking at. And so there's 6 census tracts total that we'll be looking at. And these boundaries shift minorly throughout the years, but are relatively stable. So this is really the area that we'll be looking at. And if you're familiar with either, for instance, the Oak Lodge Water Services District boundaries or the Eco Northwest study boundaries, this red overlay here sort of highlights the difference in the study area that we're talking about today versus the study area for the Eco Northwest project, for instance. So you'll see on the north end here, it extends a little bit into the city of Milwaukee. On the south end, it extends a little bit into the city of Gladstone. And on the east end, it extends past the boundary of the study area for the Eco Northwest study. There's also a portion of the Jennings Lodge area that's not covered in this study, because if we were to take these 2 census tracts, 219 and 220, we would get most of the city of Gladstone in the analysis. So we elected to keep that out of the study area. And so when we talk about where Oak Lodge is sort of situated in the greater Portland metro area, obviously it's fully encapsulated by Clackamas County. And the Portland metro area, as I was talking with the Population Research Center at Portland State University, they suggested what is called in the sort of data science field as the Metropolitan Statistical Study Area, or something like that. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it's basically 7 counties in Oregon and Washington that combined make up the Portland metro area. So that's Clackamas County in Oregon, Clark County in Washington, Columbia County in Oregon, Multnomah County, Skamania County in Washington, Washington County, and Yamhill County. The sum of those numbers are what make up the Portland metro area numbers that you'll see in this presentation. And one thing to note is that the Portland metro area and Clackamas County each include urban, suburban, and rural areas, whereas Oak Lodge really, at this point today, is pretty urban and suburban. You know, some of the rural areas that once existed in the area have been developed and are now in one of those 2 sort of designations. So that's just one thing to keep in mind throughout this presentation, because it is a little bit of sort of comparing oranges to tangerines, right? And one more note about the data sources. So as Eleanor mentioned, this data looks at and uses the census data from the decennial census back to 1970. Because of the fact that the 2020 census was open for a longer period than it usually is, as well as the pandemic and other delays, some of the 2020 data hasn't yet been released. I'll note that throughout the presentation. And then some of the data collection methods by the Census Bureau has changed over time. So some of the data uses mixed sources. So for instance, the income data was collected using the census up until 2010, when it started being collected through the annual American Community Survey. It's not necessarily best practice to mix data sources like that, but it's kind of what we had to do for this study in order to look at the amount of time that we were looking at. And some of these data, you know, it doesn't disaggregate each portion by, you know, for instance, it doesn't disaggregate race by age, or it doesn't disaggregate, you know, income by age or anything like that. And so this data may bring up more questions than answers, and that's actually a good thing. I think this data helps provide a foundation for the further conversations and questions that the community may have about itself and how it's evolved over time. So that's the intro that I have. Are there any questions about sort of the parameters that we'll be looking at today?
Nothing that's come in. I'll remind our folks in the audience, if you do have questions as we're going on, please drop them in the chat box and we'll help get them to Max.
Great. All right. So first we'll look at the total population of the area. And so each of the graphs in this presentation uses the same color scheme, with 1970 being in sort of royal blue, 1980 in red, 1990 in yellow, 2000 in green, 2010 in orange, and 2020 in teal. And it will always either read from left to right in terms of chronological order, or some of the graphs read from the top to the bottom. So those will stay consistent throughout the presentation. So when we look at the Oak Lodge total population, one of the things that stuck out to me was that you saw a fairly large jump from 1970 to 1980, about 6,000 people. But from 1980 to 2020, it was only a jump of about 5,000 people. And we'll come back to this a little bit later. But especially when we look at, for instance, the Clackamas County population, which was at about 166,000 in 1970, up to 421,000 here in 2020. And then the Portland Metro population, about 1 million in 1970 to 2.5 million in 2020. You can see that both the Portland Metro and the Clackamas County populations increase at a pretty steady rate over time, compared to Oak Lodge, which starts to flatten out after 1980. And so when we look at sort of what this means, the Oak Lodge population increases by about 1.5 times from 1970 to now, to 2020, excuse me. Clackamas County increased by about 2.5 times, and the Portland Metro increased by about 2 1/3. But because of that population slowing, the growth slowing from 1980 to 2020, if we were to look at those numbers, they'd be pretty significantly different. So those are sort of the major things to know. And again, this really speaks to the fact that Clackamas County and the Portland Metro area do have a lot of rural area and more space to expand, whereas Oak Lodge is much more locked by the development that's around it. The river on one side and then all of the development on the other sides. When we look at the total population, those are the things that I've noticed. Any questions about total population before we move on?
Max, you may not have this, but I'm curious if you know where the biggest areas for growth were in that 50 years in Clackamas County and Portland Metro at large.
I don't have data sort of disaggregated for the two areas. I will have it for the Oak Lodge area. It'll be the final report will disaggregate all of that by the different tracts. But for Clackamas County and Portland Metro, the study really looks at those as a whole, not necessarily as the specific areas. Any other questions? Okay. So next we'll talk about race and ethnicity. And I want to make a note here before we jump in, talking about what's changed and what's not changed over time. So since 1970, these 4 racial groupings have stayed the same through the whole study period. So white, Black or African American, American Indian or Alaska Native, and some other race. The naming of the groups has changed over time, but the groups themselves have stayed the same. Until 1990, Asian and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander, those were combined. They were split in 1990. And then being able to choose 2 or more races was not an option until the year 2000. So as we're looking at some of this data, just know that those are the changes that have been going on. And then Hispanic or Latino is considered an ethnicity, so they're not included in the race numbers. So when we look at the percentage of the population identifying as white, you can see that in Oak Lodge, in 1970, that was just over 99% of the population. I think there were a total of 11 people who identified as Black or African American in the total Oak Lodge area in 1970. And in terms of the percentage identifying as white, that is decreased to just under 81% as of 2020. We see similar trends in Clackamas County as well as the Portland metro area, but the decrease of the percentage of population identifying as white is a little more stark in the Portland metro area than both Clackamas County and Oak Lodge. In terms of the specific racial groups that have significant increases or changes over time, besides white, Asian is really the only other racial group that sees a significant change in the Oak Lodge area. Everything else is sort of a change of about 1 percentage point, maybe 1.5. But in Oak Lodge, you can see that in 1970, it's about 0.5%, up to about 2.5% here in 2020. So that's about a 5-fold increase. In Clackamas County in the Portland metro area, these numbers are about 10 times increase, from a little under 5% to just under 5% for Clackamas County, and 8.87% for the Portland metro in 1970, up to about 7% in 2020. So this is still a significant increase for Oak Lodge, but isn't quite as dramatic as both Clackamas County and the Portland metro area. So when we ask ourselves then, okay, for that decrease in the percentage of population identifying as white, where does that come from? Since we're really only getting sort of ticky-tack percentages from the rest of the racial groups. What we see is really a large increase, especially from 2010 to 2020, in people identifying as 2 or more races. And again, this wasn't available before the 2000 census, but you can see that across the Portland metro area, this is a real trend. And what I'd like to highlight here isn't necessarily that there's definitely a huge increase in people moving to these areas that identify as 2 or more races. It may just be sort of how people's understanding of their identity is shifting. That's sort of a hypothesis that I have around this data. You need to do a much more significant study around that, but that's sort of my guess at what we're seeing here, especially since that is standard across the whole Portland metro area. Finally, when we look at the Hispanic or Latino population, and again, these are separate from the race numbers. This question was also not asked in the 1970 census, so we start with 1980 numbers. So you can see that both the Oak Lodge and Clackamas County are increasing the proportion of people identifying as Hispanic or Latino at roughly the same rate, starting from about 1.5% to about 9.5%. For the Portland metro area, this is increasing significantly higher at a significantly greater rate. But again, there's a lot more areas in the Portland metro area that have pretty high Hispanic or Latino populations. Again, I don't have the disaggregation of those numbers and where those are coming in and where they're not. But you can see, at least for the Oak Lodge area, this is an area of increasing diversity over time. So in terms of these major findings, we're really not seeing more than a percentage point increase across most of the racial groups. And as such, Oak Lodge is diversified at a much slower rate than the Portland metro. It's largely kept pace with Clackamas County. And it sort of really depends on what that starting point was in 1970. But again, the diversification across the study area may not necessarily be to an influx of new diversity, but perhaps a shift in how people are identifying over time. Any questions around race or ethnicity in the area?
I have one, Max, and I think you really just summed it up in that beautiful last sentence. It was really that idea is it isn't necessarily a change necessarily in who's living here, but it's more of an internal shift perhaps in how people are identifying themselves. So it's sort of looking at that again, when I think of this area as sort of not really having a very consolidated, because we're not incorporated, a consolidated identity. It feels like that even manifests in with how people, like they might be the same people who have lived here since 1970, but they themselves are identifying in a different way. So that's really, and as you say, without further study, we won't be able to tell that, but I just find that really fascinating of how, what your findings are revealing about the area. So thank you for that. Not that it's a question, but because I think you just answered it, but it makes me think about the material in a really different way. So thank you for that. Yeah.
I see a raised hand from Grover.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment. For 25 years, I worked with a largely Latino population, and with the race issue and so on. The only thing we ever could get was that if they were going to pick a race to belong to, they went with the Native American. That's the only, because in truth, if you look back, it does fit there. So that's just another nuance. While it's not an ethnicity, where do they fit? You know, so that's just my 2 cents in there. And
yeah, thank you for that. Great. And again, feel free to continue to put questions or other thoughts into the chat as you have them.
Just want to elevate one that we got, which is this really shows a shift in how people can identify now,
yes,
because the government forums have allowed folks to actually identify with probably often the myriad identities and races and ethnicities that they've been part of for a very long time, or felt they were part of for a very long time.
Right. And even if you look back at these racial groupings, there's a lot of people that are still left out of this, right? Like if you're Middle Eastern, where do you decide to put yourself, right? If you're Aboriginal Australian, I don't know how many of those people we have here, but we can't until we ask, right? And so it's one of those things that, especially this some other race category ends up being a catch-all, or people just sort of select into, as Grover was saying, some other group that may or may not represent them. When it's aggregated with all of the other people that identify that way. So, some of this is in the error of how the United States groups us and is interested in these different identities, but yeah, there are definitely some limitations to this as well. So. All right, so we'll jump into talking about age next. And this is an area that I desperately wish we had 2020 data for, but we don't have it yet. It's likely to be released sometime this year, but unfortunately this only goes up to 2010. So I grouped it into 3 buckets. The first bucket being people who are 24 years and under. You can see that across the Portland metro area, there's a decrease over time, pretty standard across each of the study areas. But because Oak Lodge in 1970 was starting at just under 42% compared to about 45 and 44, those losses end up at about a little over 28% in 2010 compared to 31 and 32. So just over a quarter of people in Oak Lodge are 24 years and under as of 2010. For the sort of young adult to middle age group, 25 to 54 years, these trends are also pretty standard across the Portland metro area. A small decrease for 80 through 2000s, and then it decreases again in 2010. And you can see that these numbers for Oak Lodge and Clackamas County are pretty similar, and they're not incredibly dissimilar for the Portland metro area, although it's about 3.5 percentage points higher as of 2010. So it's roughly comparable to at least Clackamas County in this area. Where we see the real difference is in the population that's 25 and older, and this really mirrors that on the flip side of the 24 and younger group. So a pretty significant increase from about 22% to 32%, a 10 percentage point increase for Oak Lodge. Similar increase in Clackamas County, and a pretty significant jump from 2000 to 2010. It's a little different for the Portland metro area, where we actually saw a decrease over the first 4 decades with that same jump, but was sort of mitigated by the overall trend in the Portland metro area. So we really see almost a 10 percentage point difference between the Oak Lodge area and the Portland metro area as a whole. So what this tells me is that across the Portland metro area, the population's aging, but it's happening much more dramatically in Oak Lodge than the Portland metro area as a whole. And because the Oak Lodge area was already starting, quote unquote, behind in the 24 and under group, and because those losses are basically even, you know, that population of 55 plus, because that sort of young adult to middle age group is pretty much the same, we see that 55 plus group being significantly higher than both Clackamas County and Portland Metro, but especially the latter. Again, I really, really wish we had 2020 age data for this, so we could see, because obviously 10 years changes a lot in this particular data set. So I wish we had that, but we don't yet. So any questions or comments about the age data?
Really great one in the chat box from Kelly. Do you know how the population at Willamette View and Rose Villa influence the age numbers relative to the larger area?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so this is where in the final report, looking at each individual tract will, I think, be really illuminating. It's not a hugely significant increase. It's definitely significant, but it's not an enormous difference between the census tract that includes Rose Villa and Willamette View. It's not hugely different than the other tracts. You can definitely see a difference, and there is each tract has its own sort of trend. So the final report will detail all of that, but I don't know, for instance, how that changes the overall numbers. I don't have specific populations for those two complexes, but it's definitely reflected in some of the tract by tract data.
Another one that perhaps poses it in a different way, is the age shift because of older people moving in, or those who moved here when young staying put? And thank you, Greg, for that question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there are a lot of people who are aging in place, and when we look at, for instance, the age data sort of across the years, across the tracts, you can sort of see the numbers moving diagonally year to year. So, you know, people who were 45 to 55 in one census decade, those numbers, you can see a really, you know, if you were to draw a line for all of the tracts across all of the years, you see this like diagonal shift of that population moving. So for me, it really does show that there's not necessarily an influx of older people moving in. It really is people, I think, aging in place or aging at least in the area, as opposed to, yeah, people moving in. So that's a really good question.
And then I've just gotten a couple of comments or notes in the chat that it would be great to have a breakout in the over 55 group. People are living longer, which can play into the data. And then a note that Willamette View and Rose Villa collectively have fewer than 1,000 people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, both good points. And the final report does break the age groups up into, up until age 24, it's 5-year increments, but after that it's 10-year increments, with the final increment being 85 plus. So I didn't want to go into that level of detail for this presentation, because otherwise we'd be looking at a lot of graphs and everybody's eyes would kind of glaze over. But the final report will detail each of those age groups and how that changes over time for each of the census tracts. Great. Okay, so next we'll look at housing. And similar to what I just said, I'm not going to break it out into each of the different housing types and each of the different, you know, types, like, you know, number of units of housing. You know, it's not going to go into that level of detail. I'll sort of highlight some of the high level things for this. So I'll start with looking at the total number of housing units for Oak Lodge, Clackamas County, and the Portland metro area. So this one details the Oak Lodge total housing units. And what I really want to highlight here is that you'll see in each of these three graphs, it really closely mirrors the population graph. So for Oak Lodge, you can see a big jump in the total number of housing units, about 3,000 units from 70 to 80, and then another 3,000 units, about 4,000 units over the next 5 decades. So this really closely mirrors the population data. And it's the same thing for Clackamas County. If you'll recall the population graph, it has a really steady upward slope for Clackamas County. So we started about 55,000 housing units in 1970, up to 170,000 housing units here in 2020. Same for the Portland Metro, really steady upward increase from 1970 to 1920, starting at about 385,000 in 1970 up to just over 1 million housing units in 2020. So really for that, knowing that the total housing units and the total population are very closely correlated. When we break it down and start looking into some different types of housing, this is where it starts to get a little more interesting. So when we look at the percentage of housing that are rentals, and this is another area we don't, the detailed housing data, we don't have 2020 data released yet. But when you look at the rentals, you see a pretty steady increase from 1970 to 2010 in Oak Lodge. You see that reflected in Clackamas County as well, but at a lower rate and starting from a lower point. There's a similar increase in the Portland metro area in terms of the percentage of rentals, but less dramatic than in Oak Lodge. And you can actually see that as of 2010, the percentage of rental units in Oak Lodge and the Portland metro area is basically the same. So where they start from really different places, they've increased over time to be about the same to the Portland metro area. And this is especially another spot where there are pretty significant differences in the different tracts. And again, I'll release all of that in the final report, but especially when you look at the rentals by tract, you see that because of those, the Rose Villas and the Willamette Views that are in that sort of upper left-hand tract, that particular tract has way more rentals than the rest of Oak Lodge. So that I think some of those do start to skew the data, but there's no way of taking out those sort of age-restricted rentals compared to the more traditional rental units that we see. When we look at the percentage of housing that are single or duplex units during that same time frame, again, we don't have 2020 data for this yet, but you see a really similar decrease across the years for all three of the study areas. So for Oak Lodge, starting at about 83%, down to a little under 67%. And you can see this trend of decreasing and then leveling out across all three areas. And so what this means is, of course, that the housing that is more 3 or plus units are increasing over time. And again, I'm not going to go into today, here are the 3 to 4 unit structures, here are the 5 to 9 unit structures, here are the 10 to 19. The final report will cover all of that and detail how those have changed over time. But today I'm just going to look at the single and duplex units because I think this is a really interesting trend across the Portland metro area that's reflected here in Oak Lodge. And then finally, this was an area of particular interest when we were doing this study, looking at the percentage that are mobile homes, trailers, and other structures. And again, this is an area where we see between the different tracts real differences in where these are clustered and where they're not. So for Oak Lodge, actually across each of these study areas, you can see that they're pretty variable over time, which I think for some of them, trailers and these other structures really speaks to some of the transient nature that they can have. But you can see that there was a drop from 1970 and then sort of a steady increase from 80 to 2010 in Oak Lodge. For Clackamas County in the Portland metro area, there was sort of a peak in 1990 and it's since decreased for each of those areas. So Oak Lodge is seeing a slightly different trend than the other two areas. And these numbers themselves aren't terribly different, 7-8% compared to about 4.5%. For instance, comparing Oak Lodge to Portland Metro, not a huge difference, but I think still significant both in the trends as well as the raw numbers themselves. So when we think about what the major findings are, again, the percentage of rental units really matching Portland Metro, but significantly lower than Clackamas County as of 2010 in Oak Lodge. I think really speaks to how the area itself has changed, especially when you look at the share of single family units that have decreased over time. I think those are pretty inversely related, right? And then the mobile home, trailer, and other structures are highly variable, but there are slightly more in Oak Lodge than in the Portland metro area. So, and again, just noting here that when you look at the different census tracts, some of these numbers do vary pretty wildly in between them. Any questions about housing?
Yeah, two so far. In the other category under mobile homes, trailers, and other structures, does that include tiny homes and ADUs?
It's not necessarily detailed in at least the data that I can see in the census. I might be able to look back at some of the notes that each of the files that I downloaded has, but typically those are things like boats and God, what else is included in that one? RVs, things like that. So I don't know if tiny homes and ADUs are included in this other, or if they're considered a single unit structure. I'm not so sure about that one, or if they are considered mobile homes or what. I don't know how that's changed over time.
It would be really fascinating to think about, given kind of the way that they're continuing to increase in the area. The other question is, are Rosevilla or Willamette-View included in rentals, or are they owned? Yes,
those are I believe in rentals. I'm fairly certain.
And will your final report show the census tract differences in rentals versus ownerships?
That's the goal, yes, is to show this is the percent of the rentals in the tract, and can certainly just change that into ownership on the other end of that. It'll also detail vacant versus occupied units as well.
Other question, how does the interest rate and flood of building at different times affect the data?
That is a really good question that I do not have the answer to. I did not look at things like housing prices or the assessed values or interest rates. I didn't look at any of that. Or there is lots of data out there around what were the rental rates that people were paying during the various censuses, for instance. So I don't know how those sort of economic factors affect all of these numbers. That's a different study for someone else.
I'll make a
Perhaps the
note of
next
that.
MPA.
I'll make a note of that. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Great. I think that's all the questions for this section, Max.
Okay. So our final section is talking about household income. And so there are some interesting things with how the census has tracked income over time. And it's important to note that, for instance, in 1970, the income range that they were asking about was $2,500 on the low end to $25,000 on the high end. And when you look at those same numbers today, I think we're starting at 15,000 and going up to 200,000. So it was a little bit of a dance to try to get some of the numbers to align and some of the groupings of numbers to align over the years. But I think still what we'll be able to look at is the various trends that we do see. I also want to note that when we talk about low income, medium income, and high income, that those are not aligned with, for instance, federal definitions of low, medium, high. They're just aligned with the way that these numbers are grouped in the study. So they don't align with poverty levels. They don't align with class designations. It's just sort of groupings of data. So when we look at the low income households, and again, this is data we don't have for 2020 yet, from 1970 to 2010, we can see about a 10 percentage point increase for Oak Lodge compared to a 4%, 3.5% for Clackamas County, and only about a 2% for Portland Metro. And the jump that you see from, for instance, 1980 to 1990, I think some of that, again, is due to how the data had to be grouped in the study, but still, I think the trend is important to look at, of 10 percentage point versus 4 versus 2% increase over time for these low income households. And when we look at the medium income households, these numbers are pretty standard across each of the 3 study areas, starting at around 57, 55, 58%, down to 47, 48, 49% in 2010. But it really has stayed steady for this sort of medium income households from 1980 to 2010. These were pretty steady for each of the study areas. And then for the high income households, we see a little more variation here. But Oak Lodge ends up roughly at about the same place as it did in 1970, again, with some significant changes in the individual years. But the trend is basically steady over time. And then a 6 percentage point increase for Clackamas County and a 5% percentage point increase for the Portland metro area. So for me, what this says is that Oak Lodge is generally lower income than both Clackamas County and Portland metro, but there's especially a strong difference between Oak Lodge and Clackamas County. I don't necessarily want to say the area has become lower income over time, or draw similar conclusions just because of how the incomes were bracketed and how they changed survey to survey. And some of those fluctuations decade to decade may be a result of several different factors: inflation, change in income brackets, source data. And one thing that was pointed out in an earlier version of this presentation is that income doesn't necessarily translate to wealth. And so being lower income, especially for a population that is aging, it may mean that their fixed income is lower over time because they're, for instance, retired and are now collecting a pension. But that doesn't necessarily reflect the wealth of the people who live here. And I don't have access to wealth data, at least not in the Census or American Community Survey, or at least we didn't look at that. So that's sort of another boundary when looking at this. Income does not equal wealth. So I saw lots of activity in the chat. Curious what questions or thoughts came up during this section.
Yeah, I think you just answered one, but just to repose the way that the thing you just said, would a rise in low-income households be connected to a greater percent of retired residents? And also a note that income and wealth are not the same thing. So thank you for highlighting that.
Yep. Yeah, entirely possible that the increase in lower income group may very well be because of retirees. But this study doesn't disaggregate quite at that level. I think a future study could, but this was really a descriptive kind of what are we looking at in terms of the general population. And again, that's one of those questions that as you're looking at this data will lead to further questions and, okay, how do we sort of dig into this a little bit more? So.
And Kelly Lennox has a really great question that I want to make sure I'm understanding the nuance of. So Kelly, if you feel comfortable unmuting yourself and posing your question, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. You excuse me, regarding the discussion around like inflation and interest rates and that sort of thing. I was wondering about how the income groupings stack up to the median of the larger area. How do we compare to the larger area in terms of median, say? That was before you made the really good point about income versus wealth. So I know that that'll influence it. Thanks. I'll go back to mute.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question, and perhaps something that I could address in the final report. I haven't yet looked at the median incomes and how those change, for instance, tract by tract or any of that. So I think that would be a good thing for us to look at in the final report. So thanks for that note.
I think that might be all of the questions we've got for this section.
Great. So I just want to do sort of a final wrap up summary talking about sort of what are the individual major findings. I think when I think about this whole study as a whole, there's a couple of things that have jumped out at me so far. The population growth being slower in Oak Lodge than both Clackamas County and the Portland metro area. Oak Lodge is really diversifying, but it's diversifying slower than the Portland metro area as a whole. And again, the individual racial groups show some significant differences in, how is the area diversifying, right? The age of Oak Lodge trends older than both Clackamas County and the Portland metro area, and it's also aging more dramatically than both of them. The total housing units and the total population are closely correlated. I don't want to say that one causes the other, but it's certainly a really strong connection between the two. The trends in the housing type in Oak Lodge are relatively similar to the Portland metro area, with the exception of the higher share of mobile homes, trailers, and the other housing structures. And then Oak Lodge trends moderately lower income than the Portland metro area, but significantly lower than Clackamas County. So thanks so much. This has been a really fascinating project to work on. So I feel really honored to have had the opportunity.
Well, thank you, Max, tremendously for all of that effort. And I have two questions for you.
Sure.
So one of them, as your field advisor, your official field advisor, one of the questions is, what reflections do you have after completing this project? I mean, you're familiar with the area, you put a huge amount of effort into this. I know you and I have had many conversations in which it's like, okay, should I do this? Should I do that? How do we do this? So I know you've really lived with this stuff for a long time. And so just overall, in addition to that lovely final summary of things, what reflections do you have overall from looking at this project and knowing about the governance project?
Yeah. One of the first things that I did when I started this project was I had the really wonderful opportunity to do some interviews with different residents in the community. I saw a couple of you here. A theme that came up during those conversations was, how much busier the area feels, right? And, there's more traffic. McLaughlin has changed a lot. It used to be a rural area, and now it's urban and suburban. And, I think about sort of those reflections that I heard in those interviews, and sort of the contrast that I saw in, for instance, the total population numbers, right? And there hasn't been necessarily this huge, enormous influx of people into the Oak Lodge area, but traffic has increased, and for me, it really makes me think about how this area for a lot of people is seen as sort of an in-between place, right? How it's an area to go through on the way to somewhere else for a lot of people that live around it. And, I can certainly understand how that would result in frustration or, feeling forgotten about because this area hasn't had, control over its own destiny in that way. And so, especially when you look at those population numbers and who lives here compared to who's going through here and who is using the services of Oak Lodge, whatever they are, right? That there's sort of a mismatch in, the area's gotten busier or feels busier, but not necessarily in relation to the people that live here, right? So that I think was one of the things that I've been reflecting on as I was, looking at this and thinking about the conversations that I've had with people in the community. I think that's probably the biggest one that I've had so far, is how the area has changed, but and how that affects the people that do live here, the people that I talk to and the people that I've been studying. So.
And then a second question, thank you for that response. And a second question that you sort of briefly touched on earlier is, how would you advise us about how to use the data that you've presented as to how to sort of, here's past information, but how do we plan for the community's future, given this material? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of that's especially salient when we look at the age data, for instance. And, when we talk about the population aging in place, what is that going to mean in the next 10 years as, I saw a question pop up in the chat about, housing prices and things like that. How is an aging population going to affect the way that the community changes over the next 10 years, right? Because, for instance, there's only a quarter of the population as of 2010 was 24 years and younger, right? What does that mean for sort of a replenishing of people, right? And when you look at, for instance, like the housing data, basically like who is going to get to control when that population shift does happen? Who is going to get to control like what happens to the housing in the area and how the area develops or doesn't develop, right? So I think for me, what this is helpful for in terms of community conversations is both to help the community understand itself better, and be able to ask, okay, but I also want to know about this other thing. I saw someone comment just now about what are the sources of the income that people are getting. And, I would want to know, for the people that are renting, what are the racial demographics of those people versus the people who own, and what does that mean for the area, right? And if there's an increasing population of renters, what does that mean for sort of the emotional investment in the community and the investment in sort of a place, right? So for me, some of those are some of the things that I start to think about in terms of how do you use this, or where do you go with it, right?
Lovely, beautiful, Max. Thank you. I know we have just a few more minutes left, and there's a couple questions in the chat and 2 hands raised. So Cole, I'll hand this over to you. Thank you again, Max, so much.
Thanks, Eleanor. And yes, I do want to make sure that we at least get to Jan and Grover. Ed, it sounds like Max answered the question that was in the chat. So in the next less than 5 minutes, I'm wondering, Jan, if you could go first and just try and be brief.
Thank you. It's just really, you did just touch on that, how all of this information is relative to property values. And you're saying really it's a function in some respects of control over choices. So that would be the other thing. And just a comment about it is that property values here might be affected by the fact that there are cities across the river from us in the county who have much higher property values, but they're cities.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And again, this study doesn't touch on property values itself, but I think that would be a really interesting sort of next step for whoever wanted to take it.
And I just wanted to comment on the part about Oak Lodge population slow growth. Well, we are clearly, if you will, landlocked. I mean, we have a river on one side and growth all around it, and we were nearly fully built out when we moved here 30 some odd years ago. So as opposed to Happy Valley, which had 500 people and now they have 33,000 people. I mean, 23,000 people. So the point is that there's that. But the part I want to speak to as we do look at growing, and I don't most people recognize this, House Bill 2001 will take effect here July 1. And that will allow for more densification, which I'm very much in favor of. But what's not being addressed is the current structures that are in place for addressing lack sufficiency of urban services. And that's mostly been service development charges, which is new growth. So we're kind of caught in a downward spiral in that. And I want people to be aware that there is an exception in the state law that talks about our issue exactly, because otherwise our sufficiency is going to just keep declining as more and more gets packed in, and we need to address that. That's the one piece. The other is about why it feels so busy. 99E is a state highway that gets people from somewhere else to somewhere else, as you spoke of, but the statistics have shown, like around the fight for Selwood Bridge, in fact, more people in Clackamas County commute to another county to work than any other county in the at least in the tri-county area. So those are my two pieces I wanted to point to, and you spoke to them, but want to kind of put that shading on there. And thank you for a great presentation.
Thank you for that.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'm going to turn it over to Valerie Chapman to take us home.
Okay, I just want to say thank you again to Max. That was a really excellent presentation. And I look forward to having the opportunity to hear it again, to pick up data. And I want to let people know that it will be posted on our website very soon. So probably within the next 24 to 48 hours, you can go on there, or encourage other people to do that. I want to let you know that next month we will be hosting Kenneth Coleman, who is a local historian and the author of the book Dangerous Subjects, James Solis and the Rise of Black Exclusion in Oregon. Mr. Coleman specializes in the pre-Civil War era, which includes the interesting time period just before the coming of the wagon train and the shifts that took place in the years after the coming of the wagon train. We'll send out an email, as always, in a couple of weeks so that you can register. For now, please put March 12th at noon on your calendar. Sign up for our newsletter if you'd like more information, and follow us on social media, which you can sign up for by going to our website, again, Oak Lodge governanceproject.org, and you will find all of that. We look forward to having you all with us next month.